First of all, I think many organizations would have been in your position as well, right? From traditional company, maybe from healthcare, maybe from some companies which are not born on the internet era. In the first few chapters of the book, you actually try to compare SRE with the traditional way of doing IT operations, which are like ITIL, COBIT, and also DevOps in general as a culture. So
Yeah.
maybe if you can give some context and summary, what is the difference of SRE with all these other frameworks?
Yeah. So when I was writing the introduction to the book, I understood that there is not just SRE, which kind of was my focus before, because I was focused for many years on just doing SRE. But then when writing the book, of course, I needed to zoom out and see what else is out there in order to introduce SRE well in the context of the existing methodologies. So then I saw that especially prevalent today is the ITIL implementation. This is basically a framework for how you set up the operations, the IT function of an organization. And then there are also a couple of other frameworks like this, like COBIT and others. What they do well is to basically prescribe how an IT function of a big organization can be established and can be run. But then there are other kind of related things, like for instance, DevOps, right? So DevOps is a very, very high concept in the industry. This is kind of a philosophy, how you run the product delivery, especially with the short release cycles and feedback along the way from different environments and from different people, including the customer and so on. But then generally DevOps stays at the philosophical level. So basically it's a philosophy of fast software delivery and fast feedback loops, especially in the area of operations, but also in other areas. It doesn't prescribe you enough to get started, so to speak. So basically, you can think of DevOps as an overarching philosophy of running product delivery. And then you can think of other frameworks like ITIL and COBIT as frameworks for organizing the IT function of the enterprise. So now where does the SRE come in that context? So actually SRE is an opinionated implementation of the ops part of DevOps. So you can also take a very narrow kind of view on DevOps and say that just based on the name, DevOps tries to bring together development and operations. Although I think it's broader, but you can kind of take that assumption and say DevOps, based on the name, tries to unite development and operations so that they work well together. But then again, this is kind of staying at the philosophical level. Development and operations, they should be working together, but how? Should they do pair programming? Should they do pair operations? Or what should they do? How should they work together? So actually, SRE as a concrete implementation of the DevOps philosophy is this opinionated framework to implement the ops part of DevOps, so to speak. It's got concrete prescriptions of what should be put in place and also roughly by whom in order to bring development and operations together. This is also coming from the origins of SRE, which is trying as software engineers to come up with the framework for operating services. So this is then sort of software engineer led approach to operations. This is what SRE is. And then if you take those things like ITIL and COBIT for organizing the IT function of the enterprise, then DevOps as the overarching philosophy of product delivery, and then SRE being a concrete implementation of the DevOps philosophy, then you can say, okay, so actually SRE can live very nicely in parallel with ITIL and COBIT, because with ITIL and COBIT, you just set up the IT function of the enterprise. And then with DevOps, you set the overarching philosophy for product delivery. And then SRE is a piece in order to enable the operations part of your product delivery organization well.
Wow. Thanks for this explanation. So we can see clearly where it fits into this overall, along with the other IT and operations frameworks. So thanks for sharing that. You mentioned a phrase which is very popular to describe SRE. SRE is like a way of operating software if you give it to software engineers, right? I think it's a quote from Ben Trainer's Laws. I'm also interested to listen from you. What is your definition of SRE coming outside of Google? How do you describe SRE? Is there anything that you probably have different in terms of perspectives or opinions?
I think you can definitely see that it's coming from the software engineering world. I would agree that this is what happens when you task software engineers with doing operations. And actually, very interestingly, this kind of thinking, when you task software engineers with doing something, can be also applied to other areas. So, for example, being specifically in healthcare, we've got a lot of regulatory burden. So we've got a lot of regulatory compliance regulations that we have to fulfill. Traditionally, these regulations are not fulfilled from the software engineer's point of view. So they are basically fulfilled from the regulatory person point of view. And therefore, there are lots of documents that you have to write in order to demonstrate your compliance with the regulations. Those documents have to be handled in a certain way in order for you to be able to provide evidence during audits that you actually comply with the process and so on. And actually, if you task a software engineer to design the regulatory function, it will be done something completely different. So actually, I think you can apply that kind of thinking, just task software engineer with designing X. And that leads to a totally different implementation than if it comes from a place where it's not inspired by software engineering. So I think there's generally great potential to apply that kind of thinking also in other areas. And we also started actually changing our regulatory process with adding lots of automation and so on. That is definitely makes the whole process much leaner, makes the whole process much easier to apply, and then leads to actually a great acceleration of product delivery. Because if you are less constrained by the regulatory burden, then you can move much faster. So overall, definitely would still agree with the original definition by Google, posed by Ben Trainer-Sloss, that this is what happens when you task the software engineer to design the operations function. Yeah, so definitely would be happy to apply that kind of thinking also in other areas.
Thanks for the interesting perspective. So if you want to improve something, you can also apply software engineering to X problem, right? So maybe one day we'll see regulatory compliance engineer when you apply software engineering to some area. You mentioned about last time in IT, the ops team will be its own silo, development team, its own silo, and product manager, its own silo. So in the book, you actually explain how SRE actually is able to unify these three
Yeah.
different teams. So tell us more how SRE actually helps bring alignment into these three different areas.
So I think the strength of SRE is exactly in the ability to bring about that alignment on operational concerns between the product management, product development, and product operations. Whereas other methodologies and frameworks that we talked about before have got their strength in other areas like ITIL and COBIT. Their strength is design the IT function of the enterprise. DevOps, the strength is in the philosophy of product delivery. Whereas SRE, really, I think the strength of the methodology is in the alignment on operational concerns, the entire organization. The cool thing about SRE that also benefits us a lot in the Simply Digital Health platform is that it prescribes that you need to have service level objectives for your services, which are then based on service level indicators. Then once you've got service level indicators and service level objectives, then automatically you've got so-called error budgets, which are given budgets for errors. And then if you exceed your given budget for errors, then you can do data-driven decision-making about whether we invest now into reliability or whether we continue investing in features. So basically, you've got these kind of primitives that you can work with and that you can use to guide your thinking. So now how does SRE then bring about the alignment of different bodies on operational concerns? First of all, under the SRE framework, the developers, they need to go on call for their services to the extent agreed in the organization. So that means that the developers need to experience firsthand what it's like to run their services in production. And that can be just a little bit if the agreement to operate the services is such that product development is just a little bit involved in operations. And it may be that the development teams are fully on call for their services. So we can range sort of between 10 and 100% can be done by the developers themselves. The product management typically is not involved in product operations, but under the SRE framework, they need to be involved in product operations in order to actually make those decisions when we invest in reliability versus when we invest in product features. But these decisions are then done based on sound data from production. And that's based on the error budget consumption So if there is no aero budget left anymore, what do we do? The product management needs to be involved of the definition of the so-called aero budget policies that state service by service and team by team. What do we do if there is no aero budget left anymore? Do we then invest in reliability? If we do invest in reliability, then how do we do this? Do we take just one engineer and put on the reliability, or do we reprioritize the backlog and so on? As you can see, the product management becomes totally part of this entire conversation, how to guide investment on reliability. The product operations, they usually are not involved in enabling others to do operations. But under the SRE framework, that's exactly what they need to do. So basically, they don't necessarily need to run services in production, but they need to provide SRE infrastructure to enable developers to go on call and be efficient. So basically, a traditional organization puts their responsibilities on their head, so to speak, because the developers, they never went on call, but they need to go on call now. The operations people, they never enabled others to do operations, and they need to enable developers now to do operations. The product management, they were never involved in operations, but now they are part of the conversation. How do we guide the investment into reliability? As you can see, it gives each party a certain set of tasks and aligns them using those primitives like SLOs, aero budget policies, and so on, so that the whole organization then is aligned on those operational concerns, ideally before hitting production.